The sky above New Daegu was the soft, clear blue of a perfect morning. The twin suns, Hede and Hwan, warmed the air just enough to make the light breeze feel pleasant. In the main agricultural dome, the smell of rich soil and growing things filled the space. Rows of genetically adapted wheat and rice swayed gently under the simulated sunlight. A promise of another full harvest. Ji-ho wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, a satisfied smile on his face. He checked his datapad, scrolling through the yield estimates. The numbers were good. Better than good. The colony was not just surviving. It was finally thriving after 5 hard years of work. He was a logistics manager, a job that meant he knew where every gram of food, every spare part, and every liter of water was. He liked the order of it. He liked seeing the direct result of his work on the faces of his neighbors, in the full storage bins and the quiet hum of the colony's systems. P.O. A voice called. He turned to see Su-min walking between the crop rows, a specimen case in her hand. Her boots were dusty, and a small green leaf was stuck in her dark hair. "Look at this," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. She opened the case to reveal a small, 6-legged creature with iridescent wings. This is a completely new subspecies of flutter beetle. Its pollination efficiency is 20% higher than the ones near the Eastern River. I think it's adapting to our crops. Ji-ho peered at the bug, smiling at her enthusiasm. Su-min was the colony's xenobiologist. Where he saw organized rows of food, she saw a whole new ecosystem being born, a gentle marriage of Earth life and Verdant 7's native species. That's great, Su-min. Just make sure your new friends don't start eating the harvest instead of pollinating it. She laughed, closing the case. They're strict vegetarians. Promise. She looked around the dome, her expression content. It's working, isn't it? All of it? It is, Ji-ho agreed. The next supply ship from Central should be bringing the parts for the new water recycler. After that, we'll be looking at genuine surplus. Maybe even a proper school building next year. The peace of the moment was solid and real. It was the peace of hard work paying off. At the edge of the colony, where the cultivated land met the wild, vibrant forests of Verdant 7. Tae-young completed his morning patrol. He was the head of perimeter security, which most days meant checking sensor fences for curious native animals and making sure the automated weather stations were online. It was a quiet job, and he preferred it that way. His military service back on Earth had been enough excitement for one lifetime. He stopped at Watchpost 3, a small platform overlooking a steep valley. The air here was filled with the strange musical calls of unseen creatures. He took a deep breath, enjoying the scent of alien blossoms. His wristcom chirped, a routine check-in from his deputy, Da-yoon. Back at the security hut. Perimeter is clear, Da-yoon. All sensors green. It's a quiet one. Copy that, sir. Enjoy the view. Command just relayed a notice about a possible meteor shower in a few days. Might be worth watching. Noted, Tae-young said. He was about to say more when a low, unfamiliar chime sounded from his datapad. It was linked to the colony's long-range orbital sensor, a simple piece of tech that watched for ships and big space rocks. The screen, which usually showed empty green lines, was now flashing a gentle amber. A single large object had just entered the system's outer edge, moving fast. Too fast for a meteor. Tae-young's easy posture vanished. He tapped the comm. Da-yoon, I'm seeing an unidentified contact on the long range, moving at high sublight. Can you confirm from the hub? There was a pause, then the sound of rapid keystrokes. I see it, sir. Signature is, it's big, and it's not broadcasting any transit codes. Not human. Hail it. Standard first contact protocols. Now. He waited, his eyes fixed on the datapad. The contact didn't slow. It was joined by 2 more, then 4 more. Soon, the screen showed a cluster of 8 contacts. A formation. Da-Yun's voice came back, tight with confusion. No response to hail, sir. They're just coming. The amber on his screen turned to a solid, pulsing red. The objects were now close enough for basic analysis. They were not random shapes. They were angular, constructed warships. A cold feeling settled in Tae-Young's stomach. Sound the general alert. Get everyone to the reinforced shelters. Now, Da-Yun. Before she could answer, the sensor line from the orbital marker, a buoy 1,000,000 kilometers out, sent one final burst of data and then went dark. A moment later, the entire colonial network shuddered. The lights in the distant domes flickered. Tae-Young's datapad screen fizzed with static. Then a new sound filled every speaker, every every public address system in New Daegu. It was a voice, but it was wrong. It was flat, synthesized, and utterly cold. It spoke in stilted but perfectly understandable English. Attention. Organic settlement on world-designated Verdun 7. Your development is an infestation. Your planet is forfeit. You have one of your solar cycles to evacuate. Failure to comply will result in purgation. The message repeated once. Then the speakers went dead, replaced by a hollow silence dot in the agricultural dome. Ji-ho and Su-min stared at each other, the color draining from their faces. The words hung in the air, more poisonous than any gas. Infestation. Forfeit. Purgation.Go-Ho's datapad buzzed with the emergency alert, snapping him into action. His mind, used to organizing and sorting, shifted gears instantly. The main bunker under the admin building. It's stocked for 6 months. Go, Su-min. Gather anyone you see on the way. Su-min stood frozen for a second, clutching her specimen case. Her new flutter beetle, a tiny miracle of life, was now a bitter joke. She dropped the case and ran. Across the colony, lights were coming back on, running on emergency batteries. People spilled out of homes and workshops, their faces masks of shock and fear. Tae-Young's voice now crackled over the speakers, calm but firm. This is not a drill. Proceed to your assigned shelters immediately. This is not a drill. He was already running back towards the colony center, his mind racing. One solar cycle. One day. They had no ships capable of evacuation. The supply runner wasn't due for weeks. This wasn't an offer. It was a death sentence wrapped in false formality. He reached the security hub, where Da-Yun was frantically trying to re-establish any kind of long-range comms. Anything? He asked, his voice rough. Nothing. They're jamming everything. Even the emergency subspace beacon is being drowned out. But I got a burst signal out to Central Command before it died. Just our coordinates and one word, Kalar. The database tagged the ship profiles. Kalar. The name was a cold stone in Tae-Young's gut. They were a footnote in the interstellar briefings. A powerful, expansionist species. They claimed worlds, sterilized them of native infestations, and took the resources. They never negotiated. On the main view screen, a fuzzy image resolved as the colony's last working telescope focused. The ships were in orbit now. They were sleek, gray, and covered in sharp angles that looked like blades. They did not look like vessels meant for travel. They looked like weapons. One of them, larger than the others, detached from the formation and began a slow, menacing move towards the planet. They're not waiting for the cycle. Ji-Yoon whispered. Ji-Ho burst into the hub, his clothes stained with dirt from helping people move. The main bunker is at 90% capacity. The rest are heading to the secondary sites in the eastern caves. What are our options? Tae-Young looked from the screen to the faces of his friends. He saw the fear, But underneath it, he saw something else. A hardening. A refusal. He thought of the old saying, the one veterans muttered in bars. A warning nobody in the wider galaxy seemed to truly understand. Our option, Tae Young said, his voice low and final, is to survive. They think this is a simple cleaning. They have no idea what they've just started. He looked at the Kalar ship growing larger on the screen, a shadow falling across their world. They just crossed a line, and there's no way back from that. Without heading, the silence after the message was the loudest thing Su Min had ever heard. It was a heavy, dead blanket that smothered the usual sounds of the colony, the hum of generators, the distant chatter, the whisper of the wind through the crops. It lasted only a minute. Then the sky began to burn. There was no warning boom, no explosive sound. The first sign was a line of brilliant white light that seared down from the heavens, silent and pure. It touched the top of the main communications tower. For a second, the tower stood there, outlined in impossible brightness. Then it was simply gone. Not bent, not melted, gone. A shower of molten droplets rained down where it had stood. Chaos erupted. The silence shattered into screams and running feet. Su Min was pushed along in a river of people, all surging towards the admin building's main bunker. She saw Ji-ho at the doors, his face pale, but his voice steady as he directed people inside. Move, keep moving, down the stairs, all the way down. Another line of light struck. This one hit the power distribution hub on the edge of the main settlement. The blast this time was thunderous, a wave of heat and force that knocked people off their feet. Su Min stumbled, catching herself on the doorframe. She looked back. Where the hub had been was a crater, glowing orange at its edges. The lights in all the nearby domes died at once. Get in! Ji-ho yelled, pulling her inside. He slammed the heavy metal door shut, spinning the locking wheel. The sounds of the outside world became muffled, distant thuds and tremors. The only light now came from the dim emergency strips on the floor. The air smelled of cold concrete and fear. They had built the bunker well. It shook with each impact, dust sifting down from the ceiling, but it held. Through a hardened data line, a single screen showed a grainy feed from a surviving external camera. They watched, huddled together, as the silent beams of light walked across their own. The agricultural dome, her dome, was targeted. The beam sliced through the composite roof like paper. The wheat and rice, the product of 5 years of love and labor, vanished in a flash of superheated steam. Her flutter beetles, her research, her peaceful future all turned to ash in an instant. Each strike was precise, clinical. No messy explosions, no indiscriminate fire. The Kalar were not angry. They were cleaning. They were erasing the infestation, with the cold efficiency of someone wiping a stain from a counter. The bombardment did not last long, perhaps 10 minutes. When the tremors stopped, the silence returned, deeper and more complete than before. The camera feed showed nothing but smoke and ruin under the now harsh sunlight. Then the feed went black. "They've stopped," someone whispered. "Are they leaving?" Another voice asked, hope trembling in the words. Ji-ho, his face grim, watched the dead screen. "No, they're coming down to look, to make sure." Above, in the command ship, Overseer Vral observed the operation. The surface scans showed no more energy signatures, no movement beyond wind and fire. The thermal blooms were fading. Standard procedure was complete. The planet was now ready for proper assessment and mining. A single small lander detached from the mothership, carrying a crew of 5 Kalar and the Sovereignty beacon. Their job was simple: plant the beacon, run a final bioscan for contaminants, and declare the world clean. The lander set down gently in the middle of what had been the colony's central square. The air outside was hazy with smoke and carried. The sharp, unpleasant smell of vaporized plastics and organics. The Caller emerged, clad in sleek environmental suits. They moved with confident purpose, their faceted helmets scanning the area. They saw melted structures, chunks of debris, and blackened ground. It was a familiar sight. A successful cleansing. They paid no attention to the scattered, low shapes that might have been bodies. They did not look into the shadows of the fallen walls. Their sensors, tuned to detect energy weapons or communications, registered nothing. To them, the world was dead. Haiyan had been in the deepest part of the water filtration plant, recalibrating a pump when the world ended. The plant was a maze of pipes and reinforced concrete built half into a hillside. The first strike had knocked out the lights and sent a crack running up the wall. He had huddled in a service crawl space, listening to the world die above him. He waited for hours after the silence came. His ears rang. His body ached. Finally, driven by thirst and a desperate need to see, he crawled out. He pushed open a maintenance hatch that led outside near the colony's edge. The sight stole his breath. New Daeju was gone. In its place was a jagged, smoldering sculpture of destruction. The familiar landmarks were unrecognizable. The air was thick and acrid. He saw no one else moving. He was a young engineer, his life devoted to building and fixing. Now, everything he had ever fixed was dust. He moved like a ghost through the ruins, his mind numb. He was about to call out when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Near the collapsed entrance of the admin bunker, a figure was struggling to move a piece of collapsed plating. It was Su Min. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her face streaked with soot and tears, but she was alive. He ran to her, his voice a dry croak. "Su Min!" "Here, let me help." Together, they shifted the plating just enough to see the truth. The main bunker door was intact, but the blast had collapsed the entrance tunnel completely. Tons of rubble sealed it shut. They could hear faint, muffled banging from the other side. Ji-ho and the others were trapped, buried alive with their limited air. Su-Min sank to her knees, a sob wrenching from her chest. All her strength left her. Haiyan looked from the sealed tomb to the ruins around them. He felt a crushing despair. Then his eyes, trained to see how things fit together, noticed something else. Footprints, not human. They were deep, three-toed impressions pressed into the soft, ashy soil. They led away from the square. The collar. They were here. On the ground. A cold, sharp feeling cut through his despair. It was not hope. It was something darker and more solid. It was purpose. He knelt beside Su Min, shaking her shoulder gently. "Su Min, look at me." She looked up, her eyes empty. "The ones who did this," Haiyan said, his voice low and steady. "They are here, right now, walking on our ground." Her eyes focused on his. The emptiness filled with something else. A slow burning fire. "We have to move," he said. "We have to find others. Anyone." They moved away from the bunker, sticking to the shadows of the wreckage. They found 2 more survivors near the shattered greenhouse, an older mechanic named Mr. Park and a teenage girl named Mie, who had been in a storage cellar. They were terrified, but silent as dusk began to fall, painting the smoke in shades of purple and orange. They heard a new sound, a low rhythmic hum, and the crunch of footsteps. Peering from behind the husk of a ground vehicle, they saw them. 5 tall figures in gray suits, moving back towards their lander. One of them carried a tall, spike-like object, the Sovereignty Beacon. They planted it in the center of the square. A light on its tip began to pulse a slow, steady red. A claim flag on a grave. The Caller stood for a moment, looking at their work. Then they turned and boarded their lander. The hatch sealed. The engines whined, and it lifted off, disappearing into the darkening sky. The red pulse of the beacon became the only light in the square. It was the most arrogant thing Haiyan had ever seen. A hand fell on his shoulder. He nearly jumped. It was Tae-young. His security uniform was torn, and a cut on his forehead had dried black, but his eyes were clear and fierce. Behind him were a dozen more figures Dayun, a few other security personnel, and colonists who had been in outlying shelters or lucky pockets of survival. "You saw them?" Tae-young asked, his voice a rough whisper. Haiyan nodded. Tae-young looked at the pulsing beacon, then at the ring of haunted, determined faces around him. He thought of the people sealed in the bunker. He thought of the dome of wheat, the research lab, the quiet homes. All gone, not by chance, not by nature, by a conscious, cold decision. He remembered the old saying, the one that suddenly didn't sound like a boast anymore. It sounded like a simple fact. "They have the sky," Tae-young said, the words hanging in the toxic air. "So we take the ground." It was not a cheer. It was a vow. They melted away from the square, leaving the red light to pulse over the bones of their colony. They were no longer colonists. They were ghosts in a land they knew, waiting for the cleaners to come back. And the cleaners would come back. That was their mistake. A week after the cleansing, the Kalar returned in force. Overseer Vral watched from orbit as the heavy landers settled onto the scarred Earth. They carried industrial plasma cutters, seismic probes, and modular habitat units. Verdant 7 was now a work site. The initial scans from the beacon reported the atmosphere was clear of contaminants. The native life, simple and non-sapient, was already creeping back into the burned areas. It was a good sign. The planet was resilient, productive. The first mining operation was set up near the largest mineral deposit, a few kilometers from the ruins of the human colony. The Kalar engineers worked with efficiency, erecting a perimeter fence powered by a low-grade stun field enough to deter curious animals. They set up a central processor unit and began drilling. Vral reviewed the daily reports. Progress was within projections. The infestation was a memory. He felt the quiet satisfaction of a job done well. The first incident was logged as a mechanical fault. A power converter at drill site Alpha overheated and exploded shortly after dawn. It caused a 12-hour delay. Annoying, but not unusual with new equipment on a new world. The repair team noted unusual stress fractures on the housing, as if it had been tampered with, but concluded it was a manufacturing flaw. 2 days later, a survey team of 3 Kalar failed to return from a routine mapping expedition. A search party found their vehicle, parked neatly. Their equipment was inside. The Kalar themselves were gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no energy weapon residue. The only oddity was a set of strange, shallow tracks around the vehicle, not animal, not Kalar. The report suggested a possible predator attack, though the native fauna had never shown such behavior. Vral ordered the survey teams to travel in groups of 5 and carry heavier weapons. Then the water supply turned foul. The Kalar drew water from a purified stream. One morning, the entire camp woke to a sharp, acidic smell. The water in the storage tanks was undrinkable, corroding the pipes. Analysis showed it had been tainted with a potent, locally brewed compound. It was not a poison from their own supplies. It was something new, made from native plants and minerals. Someone had poisoned it deliberately. Someone with knowledge of the local ecology. Vral stood in his land-based command module, staring at the analysis. His satisfaction curdled into a cold, hard knot of anger. This was not an animal. This was not an accident. The infestation was not gone. He ordered a full sensor sweep of the area. The drones flew over the forests and hills, scanning for heat, movement, energy signatures. They found nothing but wildlife and wind. It was as if the forest itself was attacking them. Chi, a move through the undergrowth. without a sound. She had been a botanist, a tender of plants. Now her knowledge had a different purpose. In a hidden cave, she worked with a makeshift lab, crushed leaves, distilled saps, fermented spores. She wasn't making poison to kill. The Caller had medical tech for that. She was making misery. She had identified a native spore that, when refined and inhaled, caused a severe temporary inflammation of the Caller's breathing sacs. It was like a terrible allergic reaction, crippling pain, a sense of drowning, but not fatal. She mixed the spore powder with a fine, sticky gum from a twilight bloom. At night, under cover of darkness, she crept to the edge of the Caller camp. The stun fence hummed quietly. She waited until the patrol passed. Then, using a small handcrafted launcher made from a hollowed-out tree branch and a strong elastic cord, she fired a clay pot high into the air. It arced over the fence and shattered silently on the hard ground near the barracks' air intake vents. The fine powder, caught in the night breeze, drifted towards the vents. The next morning, 17 Caller miners and technicians reported to the medical unit, wheezing and clawing at their chests, convinced they were dying. Productivity for the day dropped to 0. Tae-young watched from a high ridge. He saw the confusion, the sudden flurry of activity in the camp as the Caller dealt with the mysterious illness. He allowed himself a thin, cold smile. He was no longer security chief. He was a commander of shadows. His army was less than 40 people, survivors from the bunkers, the tunnels, the distant outposts. They were engineers, farmers, geologists, cooks. And they were learning. Haiyan was their scavenger and tinkerer. He had taken apart a fallen Caller surveillance drone, finding its power cell and its sonic repeller, a device used to scare off animals. He rewired it. Now it emitted a painful, focused shriek that could shatter Caller communication devices and leave their sensitive ears ringing for hours. He used it twice on patrols, leaving the Caller disoriented and deafened before melting back into the trees. Dyung was their eyes. She had rigged up a network of simple observation posts using scavenged optical cables and mirrors, giving them silent sight lines around the Caller perimeter. She was the one who noticed the pattern in their patrols. They were predictable, rigid. They always took the same paths, at the same times. They were following a manual written for a different kind of enemy. Tae-young chose the next target. A supply convoy was moving from the main landing zone to a new drill site. It traveled along a narrow path between two rocky outcrops. The humans did not have explosives, but they had gravity. For 2 nights, Haiyan, Ji-ho, and others worked with silent intensity. They used cables made from braided vines and torn shelter fabric. They used strong poles from the wreckage as levers. They carefully loosened a large, precariously balanced slab of rock at the top of the outcrop. When the convoy of 2 ground vehicles rumbled into the pass the next afternoon, Tae-young gave a signal. With a united heave on the levers and cables, they shifted the weight. With a groaning roar, the slab of rock broke free and crashed down. It didn't crush the vehicles. It landed directly in front of the first one and behind the second, trapping them both in the narrow pass. The Caller soldiers spilled out, weapons raised, scanning the high rocks. They saw nothing. No enemy, no attack. Just a rockfall that had perfectly boxed them in. As they tried to clear the rubble, a hail of projectiles rained down from above, not bullets, but heavy stones and sharpened stakes. They clattered against the vehicle's armor, doing little damage but creating a terrifying noise. Then, from the other side, Haiyan activated his modified sonic repeller. The piercing shriek echoed in the confined space, sending the Caller stumbling, hands clamped over their helmeted heads. The humans did not fire a single shot. They did not show themselves. They simply vanished, leaving the Caller trapped, deafened, and humiliated in the dirt. It took the collar 4 hours to get a rescue vehicle to cut them out. That evening, a shaken collar patrol leader made his report to Overseer Vral. His voice, transmitted from the ground, was distorted with static and fear. "Overseer, the enemy. They are not engaging. They are in the trees. They are in the rocks. They are nowhere. They are everywhere. They harass, they trap, they disappear. We never see them." Vral demanded, "What did they want? Did they make any demands?" A pause. Then a different voice came on, low and clear, speaking in translated color. It was a human voice, calm and cold, no way out. The transmission ended. Vral stared at his console, the cold knot in his gut turning to ice. This was not a military fight. This was something else. A sickness. A rot. And it was spreading through his ranks faster than GA spores. His miners were afraid to leave the camp. His engineers checked every piece of equipment 3 times. Progress on the mining operation had ground to a halt. They had the ships, the weapons, the technology, and they were losing completely to ghosts. Overseer Vral stared at the latest damage report. A full ore hauler stuck in a pit that had been expertly disguised with woven branches and dirt. Its crew was unharmed, but shaken, having been pelted with rotten fruit that contained a dye staining their suits a bright, humiliating pink. The cleanup and decontamination would take days. The laughter from the other miners, he suspected, would last much longer. Morale was crumbling faster than the planet's rocks. He had followed the manual. He had deployed more patrols. He had ordered wider sensor sweeps. He had even authorized the cautious use of area denial weapons, scorching small sections of forest where activity was suspected. It yielded nothing but ashes and more fear as his troops became convinced the flames themselves were hiding their invisible enemy. His superior, High Assessor Clore, was beginning to send impatient queries. Production was non-existent. The cost of this operation was now far exceeding the projected value of the minerals. Vral needed a result. A definitive, overwhelming show of force that would end this farce. He made his decision. Order the glorious blade and the swift judgment to lower their orbits. Prepare for a full planetary sweep. We will deploy every ground unit we have in a coordinated grid pattern. We will scorch every kilometer of land within 100 radii of this camp. If they are in the ground, we will burn them out. It was a brute force solution, a desperate one. It would consume vast resources and leave the mining zone a wasteland, but it would prove the infestation was gone. It would prove he was still in control. The orders went out. On the surface, collar troops began to mobilize, pulling back from outposts to form a large, concentrated force. In orbit, the 2 destroyers began to shift, their weapons powering up for a sustained bombardment dot in a deep cave, hidden behind a waterfall that fed into the tainted stream the humans watched. Dayun's mirror network and scavenged Kalar scanner parts had given them a crude but effective picture. They saw the ships moving. They saw the troops gathering. "They're going to burn it all," Hyen said, his voice flat. He was looking at a schematic of the old mining surveys. A saturation strike. They'll turn this whole region to glass. Tae-young studied the data. His face was hard. They had hurt the Kalar, bruised their pride, stalled their machine. But this was the endgame. They could not hide from that. They had known this moment might come. They had a plan, but it was not a plan for fighting. It was a plan for speaking. "Is it ready?" Tae-young asked, turning to Hyen. Hyen nodded towards the back of the cave. There, nestled among crates of scavenged parts, was a misshapen metal box, covered in wires and patched together panels. It was the heart of a collar shuttle subspace transmitter, painstakingly rebuilt over weeks from a dozen different wrecks. It had one charge in its cracked power cell. It could send one strong burst. It could not reach Earth. Its range was limited to the Kalar fleet in orbit and, with luck, the nearest Kalar relay station. "It's ready," Hyen said. "But we can't call for help. Central Command won't get it in time." "We're not calling for help," Tae-yong said. He looked at the others gathered in the dim light. Su-min, her hands stained with plant dyes. Jia, holding a clay pot of spores. Jiho, who kept them all fed with foraged roots and stolen Kala rations. "We're sending a message. But not to our people. To theirs." Su-min understood first. "A lesson." "Yes," Tae-yong said. "We show them. We show everyone who might be listening on their channels what happens here. We don't beg for rescue. We document their failure." The plan was simple and insane. They would not just transmit a distress call. They would broadcast a live feed. They would use every piece of visual data. They had Daeun's mirror glimpses, stolen helmet cam footage from ambushes, audio recordings of confused Kalar patrols. And they would narrate it. Ji-ho, with his calm logistical mind, would be the voice. He began writing notes, not as a victim, but as an analyst. "Observe the unprotected rear flank of the standard patrol formation," he practiced, his tone cool and clear. "Note the vulnerability of the water reclamation unit to simple biological agents. As the Kalar Armada finalized its preparations above, the humans below made theirs. They positioned mobile camera units, repaired collar tools, at key points. They prepared their final, grand act of sabotage, not to destroy, but to be seen destroying. The moment came at dusk. The Kalar ground forces were in position, a vast ring of gray armor and weapons. The orbiting destroyers glinted in the fading sun. Like two sharpened knives, Tae-yong gave the signal. On the surface, a series of small, controlled explosions erupted not near the collar, but at the abandoned main mining processor. Hyen had rigged it to collapse in on itself in a spectacular but harmless shower of sparks and bent metal. Every collar sensor instantly focused on it. At that exact moment, Hyen activated the transmitter. The power cell whined, and a powerful, unencrypted data burst shot into the sky. On every collar bridge, in every cockpit, on every communicator in the system, the broadcast overrode standard channels. It opened with the chilling, synthesized voice of the original collar ultimatum. "Your development is an infestation?" Then it cut to the silent, searing beams destroying the colony. Then the screen split. On one side, the historical footage of the slaughter. On the other, live footage from the ground. The confused collar troops staring at the collapsing processor, their formation clearly visible and exposed. Jiho's voice began, calm and devastating. "This is a tactical review of Kalar pacification operations on Verdun 7, the voice said, as if lecturing at a military academy. Initial orbital cleansing was successful in eliminating fixed infrastructure. However, subsequent ground occupation has failed due to critical misunderstandings of asymmetric resistance." The broadcast showed the trapped convoy, with arrows highlighting the kill zone. Example 1. Poor terrain assessment leading to ambush vulnerability. It showed the Kalar soldiers wheezing from GA's spores. Example 2. Inadequate biochemical defense against local environmental agents. It showed the pink-stained miners. Example 3. Failure to maintain unit morale under persistent psychological pressure. The live feed continued, now showing the vast, clumsy ring of collar forces, the destroyers hovering above. Current collar response, strategic overcommitment. Concentrating forces for area denial reveals a lack of tactical flexibility and a failure to locate the insurgent base of operations. This formation is highly vulnerable to dispersed, harassing actions which will, on the command ship, Overseer Vral watched, his blood running cold. This was not an attack. This was an execution of his reputation, his career, his species' aura of invincibility. He could see his officers staring at the screens, their confidence turning to horror as their every mistake was clinically dissected for the entire fleet and possibly the galaxy to hear. Rival species monitored collar channels. They would be seeing this. They would be taking notes. Find that transmission source and destroy IT. He roared, but the broadcast wasn't coming from one source. Hyen had wired it through a series of relays, bouncing the signal around the ruins. To silence it, they would have to glass the entire planet, and they were now broadcasting that attempt live. Chiho's voice continued, relentless. The primary error, however, remains the initial one. The Keller assumed a compliance-based outcome. The human doctrine of retaliation was not factored. Once engaged, human resistance does not seek a negotiated peace. It seeks to redefine the cost of victory until that cost becomes unacceptable. There is no tactical solution here. Only a strategic failure that began the moment the first shot was fired. The broadcast ended with a live image of the two Keller destroyers, poised to fire, symbols of overwhelming power that had been made to look foolish and slow. The final words were not Jiho's. They were Taeyong's, spoken softly but clearly into the recorder days before. You were warned. Then, silence. On the bridge of the command ship, the silence was deafening. The tactical screens glowed. The weapons were ready. But every Keller present knew that firing now would not be a victory. It would be the final violent proof of everything the human voice had just said. They were not purging an infestation. They were starring in a lesson on how to lose. Vral stood perfectly still, the weight of his failure, and the unforgiving nature of the enemy he had created, pressing down on him. He had crossed them. And now, the entire galaxy was watching, and there was no way out that did not end in ruin. The silence in orbit was not peaceful. It was the quiet of a breath held too long, the stillness before a shatter. On the command ship, Overseer Vral stared at the main screen, now dark. The human broadcast had ended, but its echo seemed to vibrate in the very metal of the deck. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for the order to unleash the orbital strike, to erase the problem and their humiliation in a storm of fire. His hand hovered over the command console. He wanted to give the order. The rage and shame demanded it. But a colder, more terrifying thought held him back. If he glassed the planet now, what would that recording look like to the high assessors? It would be the final piece of evidence. It would show him Vrail ordering the destruction of a world not to defeat an enemy, but to cover up his own catastrophic failure. He would be the villain in the human's lesson. Before he could move, a new priority alert flashed. An inbound vessel emerging from subspace at the system's edge. Its transponder identified it not as a human ship, but as a collar dreadnought, the higher resolution. It was a ship from the core fleet, belonging to the Strategic Command. Vral's heart sank. They had seen the broadcast. They had come not as reinforcements, but as auditors. The higher resolution did not hail him. It simply took up a high orbit and opened a direct, secure channel to his private terminal. The face that appeared was High Assessor Clore, his superior, but Clore's expression was not one of anger. It was worse. It was a mask of icy, professional disappointment. Overseer Vral, Clore said, his voice devoid of any emotion. The operation on Verdun 7 is terminated. You are to cease all offensive actions immediately. You will stand by to receive an emissary from this ship. You will comply with their instructions without question. Your command authority is hereby suspended. The screen went blank. Vral felt the foundation of his life crumble beneath him. Suspended. In all likelihood, disgraced. He had been made an example of, just as the humans had intended. On the surface, the humans watched the new, larger ship arrive. Through their scavenged scanners, they saw the Kalar ground forces stand down, their weapons powering off. The two destroyers that had been poised to strike moved back into a passive holding orbit. They saw it, Hyen whispered, his body trembling with exhaustion and sudden. Shocking relief. Tae-young did not relax. He watched, his eyes narrowed. It's not over. They're not leaving. They're changing players. A single, elegant shuttle descended from the Iron Resolution, not to the mining camp, but directly to the scorched landing field where the Sovereignty beacon still pulsed its red light. Tae-young, Su-min, and Ji-ho moved to observe from the ruins at the edge of the square. They kept to the shadows, their own weapons, a mix of sharpened tools and scavenged Kalar sidearms ready. The shuttle door opened. A single Kalar emerged, unarmed, his suit a more ornate silver gray. He was accompanied by 2 guards who remained at the ramp. The emissary looked around at the ruins, then at the beacon. He made a gesture, and one of the guards came forward and deactivated it. The red pulse died, leaving only the natural light of the twin suns. Then the emissary spoke. His amplified voice translated into stiff English. We seek to parley with the representatives of the human survivors. We come under a flag of truce. We have terms. Tae-young looked at Ji-ho and Su-min. After a long moment, he stepped out from behind the broken wall. He walked into the open square, stopping 20 meters from the emissary. He wore patched-together clothes, and his face was gaunt, but he stood straight. I'm listening, Tae-young said, his voice carrying across the empty space. The emissary bowed his head slightly. The Kalar High Command recognizes the unresolved situation on Verdun 7. We are prepared to offer terms. Full reparations for the damage to your colony. Medical and humanitarian aid. A treaty guaranteeing your sovereignty over this world. And safe passage for any who wish to leave. The words hung in the air, sweet and unbelievable. Su-min felt a dizzying rush of hope. It was everything they could have begged for. Tae-young did not move. In return for what? The cessation of your broadcasts, the emissary said, a flicker of discomfort in his translated tone. The data stream you transmitted. It must stop, and the data must be surrendered. You must agree to no further acts of aggression. Tae-young was silent for a full minute, looking not at the emissary, but at the ground where his home had been. He thought of the people in the collapsed bunker. He thought of the terror of the orbital strike, the months of hiding and fighting like animals. He thought of the cold, clinical voice of their first warning. He looked back at the emissary. No, the word was simple, flat, and final. The emissary stiffened. These terms are more than generous. You have won a concession few have ever received. You misunderstand, Tae-young said, taking a step forward. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a knife. This is not a negotiation. You do not get to offer terms for a war you started and a crime you committed. You do not get to buy our silence. He pointed a finger at the deactivated beacon. You came here, gave your warning, and killed us. That was your choice. From that moment, you lost the right to dictate anything. The emissary was speechless, off balance. This was not how it was supposed to go. Tae-young continued. Here is what will happen. You will leave this system. All of you. You will designate it a neutral zone, off limits to collar ships. You will pay reparations in materials and technology to be delivered by a third-party species. And you will hand over Overseer Vral and his direct command staff. They will stand trial here, under our laws, for the attack on this colony. The emissary recoiled. That is impossible. To hand over our own to alien justice. You should have thought of that before you followed his orders. Tae-young interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. You think this is about revenge? It's about consequence. You crossed a line. You created a new set of rules. These are them. This is the only way out we are offering you." He turned and gestured to the ruins. From the shadows, more human survivors emerged. They were thin, dirty, armed with makeshift weapons. But there were more of them than the caller had believed, and their eyes were all the same unyielding. "The broadcasts stop when your ships leave and your criminals are in our custody," Tae-young said, his final word. "Not before. You have 1 hour to decide." Then the lesson continues. The emissary looked from Tae-young to the ragged line of humans, to the ruins that bore silent witness. He finally understood. The humans were not fighting for a treaty. They were fighting to set a precedent, to make the galaxy understand the permanent, ugly cost of crossing them. They had turned their survival into a weapon that could shatter the Calor's reputation forever. He gave a stiff nod. "I will convey your position." Back on the command ship, Vrao received the order. He was to surrender himself and his officers. He was no longer an overseer. He was a sacrifice offered to appease the new, terrifying reality the humans had forged. The Calor fleet left within the hour. The last ship to leave was the small shuttle, carrying Vrao and 5 others in restraints. It landed in the square, deposited its prisoners, and left without a word. Tae-young and Geo approached. Vrao looked at them, his proud bearing gone, replaced by a hollow defeat. He did not see monsters. He saw tired, dirty people who had refused to break dot as the last Calor ship vanished into the blue sky. Su Min walked over to the spot where her lab had been. A single green shoot had pushed its way through the ash. She knelt beside it. It was over. They had been warned, and there had never been any other way out.